I don't think we'll ever get to a point where we live without power outages. So what we need to make sure is that it isn't just about keeping the lights on all the time, but that we're building resilience into the community as well. I think that's what's really important about the federal funding, is that some of the money will go to utilities and some of the money will go to local communities who can address their needs and do things like building microgrids for hospitals or building microgrids for schools.
Hello, everyone. This is Barbara Humpton, CEO of Siemens USA, and thanks for listening to The Optimistic Outlook. I'm recording this early in 2023, but today I'm actually thinking about the early days of the century, a moment in the year 2000. Not Y2K, which our younger listeners might not even know about, but a moment when the National Academy of Engineering brought together members to produce a list of the top 20 engineering achievements of the 20th century. And you know, it's fascinating to see what they put on the list. It's pretty impressive, to say the least. Things like spacecraft, the automobile, highways, computers, the internet, the telephone, all of these inventions and innovations that we can't imagine living without today. But you know what was at the very top of the list? The power grid. And as you think about it, it makes sense, right? Because electrification, our nation's power grid, is what enables everything else on that list. The question now is, what do we need the grid to enable in this century? And is our grid, as it's currently designed, up for the job? We're going to explore this today with Karen Wayland. She's the CEO of Gridwise Alliance. They're an organization serving the electricity industry with a vision to transform the U.S. power grid. Take a listen. Karen Wayland, welcome to the podcast, and thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Barbara. I'm excited to be here with you.
Karen, with the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act, we really now have significant government resources, in addition to our private sector investment, focused on bringing the electric grid into the future. And we'll get into that. But first, help us understand the current state of the grid. We know that the grid is under a lot of stress, particularly as climate change intensifies, as more renewables come online, and as we also see some progress incorporating new technology. What did we accomplish in the last decade, and how would you describe the state of the grid today?
Well, we have the technologies to have a modern grid that provides the functions that allow it to be the platform for decarbonization, to be more reliable, resilient, and affordable. The issue is that the deployment of those technologies is happening in a patchwork fashion around the country. So there are some utilities that have been able to make investments in all these innovative technologies and have very modern systems. And then there are other utilities where they may not even have the most basic advanced technologies like an advanced meter for the customers. So we're hoping that this federal funding allows us to address this inequity in grid modernization across the country, so that all customers and all consumers are connected to a modern grid and get those benefits.
Tell me a little bit, Karen, about the role of Gridwise Alliance in this transformative time.
Well, the Gridwise Alliance developed a set of recommendations for the infrastructure package, doing a whole series of stakeholder engagements. And we were very happy that most of our recommendations ended up in the infrastructure bill with respect to the grid programs. So our number one priority in the coming years is to make sure that money, not just at the Department of Energy, but at the Department of Transportation and the Commerce Department and elsewhere, really goes to the places that need it most, that we have a very effective implementation, and that we are highlighting the kinds of technologies that need to be deployed with this money, so that everywhere consumers can experience the benefits of a modern grid.
So let's start talking about then what's possible over this next decade. You know, Karen, we've been thinking a lot at Siemens about how the power grid can be not just our economic backbone, but a powerful tool to decarbonize society. Our view for the future is basically, let's electrify as much as possible, especially mobility. We're really bullish on the concept of a national EV charging network. And in fact, last year, we committed ourselves to manufacturing more than 1 million EV chargers in the U.S. in a 4-year period. And we just recently announced that we're locating a second manufacturing hub for EV charging operations in Carrollton, Texas. But when we think about this electric future, we know that in many ways, the market can only grow as fast as our grid enables it to. And I have a few questions on the topic, but let's start with this one. what kind of stress does scaling EV infrastructure potentially add to the grid?
Well, there are some engineering issues where you're actually dealing with increased load based on the demand of electrifying transportation, and also potentially a system that wasn't designed for the kind of intermittency of that load. But the flip side of that is that load and those batteries actually provide a possibility of increasing the capacity of the grid if we have the control systems and the hardware to take advantage of that. And what I see as the biggest stress is not necessarily that we're going to get there with the technologies that allow us to manage this exciting development of transportation electrification, but there's a mismatch in timescales. So today, if you're a consumer, you can go out to the car dealer and buy an electric vehicle, and you don't have to ask permission from anybody to do that. But if you are, say, a fleet and you'd like to electrify your fleet, you may go to your utility and find out that, well, you can purchase the vehicles and the charging infrastructure. It may take the utility 18 months to 2 years to actually do the upgrades on the grid side to enable that fleet electrification. And so I think that we have to be really careful about finding ways to smooth out that difference in timing between what the consumer can do and what the utility is physically able to do, and potentially also be aware that sometimes those costs are not necessarily borne just by the consumer that is asking for the changes on the grid.
Well, that's a good point. And in fact, I'm curious, as we look to apply grant funding, say that's coming from these federal sources, and even as companies make investments, what do you think are the most urgent priorities for grid modernization in this transition to electric fleets? You mentioned, needing to be consistent across the country. But are you seeing places where things are moving along well that might serve as a model for others?
Well, I have a prop. We actually did a report on the near-term grid investments for integrating electric vehicle charging infrastructure. And we did that with a number of Gridwise utility members and some of the grid equipment manufacturers, really thinking about what are the kinds of investments that we're going to need to make on the grid in order to help with this transition to electric vehicles. And there's a series of them. First, we need an advanced meter at the customer interface so that there can be two-way flows, not just of power back and forth, but also information. So control systems back and forth. We need potentially dynamic line rating in order to increase the capacity of the grid and to allow increased visibility for how that power is moving around the system. We will need distributed energy resource management software systems, which will monitor and control those distributed energy resources like electric vehicles. We'll need more of a process thing, which are interoperability standards, so that people who are driving around can use every charger that they find, and that the utility can interface with every charger that a consumer would like to install on the grid. And then finally, we expect that in order for this to be a truly integrated grid where vehicles can provide services to the grid and vice versa, that we're going to need a modern communication network based on broadband, whether that's wireless or fiber, in order to enable all the data to flow across the system, to give grid operators the flexibility and also to give the consumers the information that they need in order to figure out how and when and where to charge.
Yeah, so it sounds like it's not just a hardware problem, right? We've got to get the right equipment out there to be able to support these changes on the grid, but there are also some software changes that needed to be made. And man, what I'm hearing as we have conversations with our cloud providers is that it's an incredible amount of data that's now flowing in the automotive sector. So, in addition to power and comms, we've got to have data storage, and all of those things, all of those technologies are absolutely critical to this decarbonized future that we are looking forward to. Now, we recently did a podcast episode focused on our partnership with the utility ComEd in Chicago, where our good friend Gil Quinones has recently stepped in as the CEO. And what we've done with ComEd, even before Gil's arrival, was we've been working together on a microgrid model managed by software that can help communities speed up the transition to renewables and have the capability to maintain power at all times, even when the utility grid experiences outages. Help us understand the role that utilities play in preparing the grid for EV charging and increasing that share of renewables online.
Well, first of all, let's give a shout out to Gil Quinones, who is a rock star in the utility world and truly a visionary. And when you think about his understanding of the importance of data and in managing a utility and the grid itself, he's been at the forefront of the digitalization of the grid. So kudos to Gil, who has been our board chair at Gridwise for the last year or 2 years and is stepping down to focus fully on ComEd. So it's been a pleasure to work with Gil. But to answer your question about the role of the utility in preparing for EVs, there are utilities do a significant amount of long-term planning for the investments in how to make sure that the grid operates reliably. So as consumers are thinking about transportation electrification, buying new electric vehicles, as policymakers are thinking about those goals of transportation electrification, and then also bringing on more renewables, there has to be a coordination of planning across both the policy sphere and the utility planning process, because there are a lot of things that are outside the utility's control. For example, how many electric vehicles are going to be in their service territory. So in addition to the kinds of engineering that they'll have to do and the technology deployment, there's going to have to be coordinated forecasting and planning, both on the policy side and on the utility side, to make sure that the investments are made so that the utility grid is a platform for decarbonization.
Yeah, we've seen examples of this as we've worked across the country. States or very large cities actually have put together teams that include, all of the parties that are critical to making this transition go smoothly. And that's important. But let's get back to the question of resources. What resources do you see that are available through the bipartisan infrastructure law to prepare the grid for the EV charging? And how is this going to help us build out our national network faster?
Right. Well, there's billions of dollars in the infrastructure bill for modernizing the grid, and it's focused on different parts of the grid, functions of the grid. So there's over $7 billion for EV charging infrastructure over at the Department of Transportation. And then over at the Department of Energy, there is somewhere on the order of, depending on how you look at it, 11 to $15 billion for grid investments to enhance resilience and increase system flexibility. And what we have been very focused on is making sure that there's coordination between the Department of Transportation with its charging infrastructure money and the Department of Energy, which has the resources to make investments in the grid. And there is in the infrastructure bill a joint DOE DOT task force on transportation electrification specifically for that coordination. And I will note that we've talked about a modern communication network that's critical for helping to move through the stage of electrification. And there's money in the Department of Commerce for utility communication networks. So it's a place where utilities don't necessarily look to resources. This is a new program for middle mile broadband, but it is a significant amount of money that is available for utilities to make investments in the communication networks that are going to be essential for transportation electrification.
That's excellent to know. And I know Gridwise Alliance will be helpful in pointing people to the resources that they are going to so desperately need. But let's switch gears, switch channels maybe for a minute and think about resilience. Oh man, there have been a number of big events, whether it's floods, winter storms, hurricanes, wildfires, you name it. And what it's shown us is the connection between reliable power and our own health and safety, as well as our, economic security. So we know that power outages are happening much more frequently than they did a decade ago. And in the bipartisan infrastructure law, there's a program addressing this. It's called the Grid Resilience and Innovation Partnerships Program, or GRIP program. And I understand that the Department of Energy is now accepting applications for project funding. Who can apply for it? And what do you think we can achieve by leveraging the grid funding to its full potential?
Well, there are actually four different programs within the GRIP program. Uh, a lot of money for resilience, and then I mentioned the smart grid investment grants for flexibility as well. And it depends on which pot of money, who the eligible entity is. So utilities are eligible to apply for a significant amount of the money in the resilience side, and also in grid flexibility. And then state, local, tribal, and other governments are eligible for the $6 billion that is in this resilience innovation program. We do know that utilities are very interested, and many of them have the resources and to apply for the grants. There are some smaller utilities that we worry may not have the resources to pull together grant writers and write those applications. And we also worry that some of the smaller government entities that should be making resilience investments may be hampered in accessing that funding by, a lack of technological expertise, or even the resources, the human resources to write those grants. So there is a lot of work at the Department of Energy to address this need for technical assistance. And there are some outside groups also that are gearing up to provide technical assistance. But making sure that this money goes to the right places to really strengthen resilience is one of our key focus over the coming years.
Well, I'm kind of curious about your view about what we can accomplish. We've been looking at this idea of using software systems for, microgrids. We've been looking at battery storage and, new forms of power production. And we think all of that is delivering more reliable power at all times. What's your perspective? Do you see a future without power outages?
I think we can get to a point where we have significantly improved the reliability and resilience of the system. I don't think we'll ever get to a point where we live without power outages. People say we could get to that point, but nobody could afford the system at that point. So what we need to make sure is that it isn't just about keeping the lights on all the time, but that we're building resilience into the community as well, so that we are making sure that those people who may have health issues, or who are, don't have the resources to go to a hotel, or, that we're taking care of those people, that we have resilient centers, critical infrastructure, where we have the microgrids that can keep lights on when the overall power system may experience disruptions. But we have to think about resilience differently. I think we have to think about, resilience as a community responsibility, not just the utility. And I think that's what's really important about the federal funding, is that some of the money will go to utilities, and some of the money will go to local communities who can address their needs and do things like building microgrids for hospitals, or building microgrids for schools, or setting up a system where you can use electric school buses to charge, cooling stations in the summer. So there's some really, really exciting new innovative applications of existing technologies, and also deployment of new technologies, that gives me a lot of hope for, our ability to meet the climate challenge.
And this is a really important point. We got to think about the objective. And the objective isn't necessarily to simply have constant flow of electricity, but to actually just be able to do the things that need to be done. As we now talk about outages in the bigger picture, you've got me thinking about a tribal community in Northern California, Blue Lake Rancheria. We helped them put in a microgrid, almost a decade ago now. And what we've seen, we love to stay in touch with them, because over and over again, we've seen great stories of whether there's, response to wildfires, whether it's, heavy storms, even a recent earthquake, where the grid has come down, but Blue Lake Rancheria has stayed up. And they've been able to serve as a power station to the surrounding communities, allowing people to come for loading up their batteries, et cetera, and providing that continuity. So you've heard it from Karen. There is technology there to help us achieve our goals, but what's the right goal? is the right goal a grid with zero outages, or is the right goal a resilient grid that makes use of the resources available to us to assure we meet our most important objectives? One of the things I definitely want to make sure we cover is the people aspect of this. We're really excited about the potential for new careers as the grid continues to transform. We've seen this already in our manufacturing investments, the ones I mentioned earlier. But another area we need to catch up in is just workforce development in digitalization and automation. There's a lot of technologies people worry are sort of coming for our jobs, but actually what's happening is that they're just changing our roles and maybe even creating new opportunities for it. We've seen a massive retirement wave of experienced workers. Manufacturing now has more than 800,000 open positions. What's the job outlook in the power sector? How are utilities looking at this? And how is this new technology changing the skill requirements of the workforce?
Well, those are two great questions. The first is, are there workforce issues? And I will tell you that when I've talked to some of our member utilities, they say that's one of the biggest challenges in actually acquiring and then spending the money to do the grid modernization is supply chain issues and workforce issues. So the utility industry is certainly experiencing retirements, aging workforce, and then also a change in the skills required to operate the system. So those two pieces, the workforce that's leaving, the general demand for technology expertise across sectors is creating a lot of competition. And one of the things with the infrastructure bill is that there is $42.5 billion over at the Commerce Department for broadband. And if you think about the utility business and then you think about broadband, so expanding broadband access, the grid modernization and broadband are very linked, and even if they're done separately, the workforce skills are very similar. And so with this large amount of money for broadband, there may be some increased competition for qualified workers. So that is a big fear for us in terms of really accelerating the transition that the infrastructure money is designed to do. And so I was just on a call with a state energy director yesterday asking for resources and ideas for how they can develop the workforce training and development on the side, parallel to figuring out how they're going to spend the money for grid modernization. So it's on everybody's minds. And I think that the utility industry has had a hard time attracting young people into its workspace. But the changing nature of the utility business with the move to clean energy and this digital grid actually is likely more attractive to young people. So I'm hopeful that with the right programs, with the right apprenticeship programs, the right outreach at the high school level to help people think through what they want to do in college or community colleges or technology training, that we will start to attract more people into the energy infrastructure business.
While we're on this topic, let's talk a little bit then about diversity and inclusion. At Siemens, we want to tap into all the talent that exists across the workforce, and we're really focused on attracting new talent from diverse labor pools into the work that we do. How diverse is the power sector when it comes to its workforce, and are there similar challenges? Are there things that we can be working on across sectors to help?
Well, as someone who has to regularly put on panels, and I try really hard to make sure that those panels are not manels, the utility industry is still dominated by white men, but that's changing, and I think something that is going to help attract diversity is that these jobs are good paying jobs. They are not minimum wage jobs. And with the right kinds of outreach, utilities can reach new demographics to increase diversity, but also to create some steadiness in that workforce, because it is really important when you spend 4 years training a lineman or the same amount of time with people in your grid operating rooms, that you want to make sure that they stay with you so that you can continue the benefits of that investment over a long career. So really finding new people to bring into the industry is going to be important for that lasting workforce.
Yeah, for sure. I'm actually excited about, having seen the tools that are being used today. You go into one of the tech centers, say at ComEd, and what you see looks like a space program, control panels everywhere and people huddled around screens, making decisions about, the test results, et cetera. So I actually do think that there are some kids who today are playing video games who are going to soon discover that, hey, they've got a great future in our power sector.
We just did a panel at our last Grid Connects conference in December on the anatomy of a utility pole. And we had a lineman there talking about how even the job of maintaining a utility pole and maintaining the wires is changing and becoming far more digital. And he even talked about how they have earth movers that have a control system that straps on, and the kids who've grown up playing video games are the best ones at doing this remote control of the new equipment that they have. And so it's, drones and diggers and other things that's playing with video games actually can contribute to your career.
All right. So all you caregivers and parents out there, let it be known, kids can play their video games guilt-free. Oh, Karen. So I'd like to end now with the question I love to close out with each episode. If we're able to apply the concepts we've been discussing and modernize the power grid, paint us a picture of how this is going to impact our future.
Well, my favorite example is a very concrete one, and that's the example of the Chattanooga utility, EPB. And with the Recovery Act funding, in 2009, 2010, they invested $220 million on upgrading their systems and building out a smart grid capability. So really a modern grid. And as they were doing that, they pledged to all of their customers that they would be a 1 gigabyte city, that as they invested in their utility communication network, they would also be expanding access to broadband through that system. So what they have is an incredibly modern grid, but they've also been able to provide high-speed internet to everybody in their territory. And they're now a 10 gigabyte city. And a recent study looked at the economic benefits of those early investments. And over the last 10 years, the study estimates that there's been somewhere on the order of $8 to $9 billion of economic development as a result of that initial investment in the smart grid. So if you go to Chattanooga, it's a really exciting place where there's tech companies moving in, where there's new development downtown. And it's a really exciting example of what we can look to for the benefits of a modern grid. But we have to make sure it's happening for everybody and not just in certain places.
How exciting. With power and comms, everyone can join the digital economy. And frankly, people can choose to live where they want to live. If as long as they're in a business that can be done digitally. So this is an exciting time, and we really appreciate having your insights. Karen Wayland, thanks so much for joining us. I hope you've enjoyed this conversation. And I want to encourage you now to go to our show notes and learn more about everything we talked about in this episode. At Siemens, we're part of the effort to reinvent the grid to meet our needs in the 21st century, and we stand ready to support more customers and stakeholders. Thanks again for listening. Please follow us on social media and on your favorite podcasting platform. Thank you for tuning in.